Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to my YouTube channel or my website, if that's what you're visiting. So today's episode is something I wanted to talk about, which I've dubbed the black hole within, or what else causes depression. Interesting topic, I hope. Hopefully something useful. If you guys haven't seen my introductory video or any of my other videos, my name is Alistair Taylor, and I hold a doctoral degree in clinical psychology from an American Psychological Association accredited school here in Hawaii, the Hawaii School of Professional Psychology. And the purpose of my site, in a real quick nutshell, is to try to take all things neuroscience, cognitive and affective psychology, and biological bases of human behavior, and try to simplify it and present it in a way that is practical and useful for folks in their day-to-day lives. So that's the essential goal, and that's the goal of today's discussion as well. So without much further ado, why I wanted to present on this topic. Depression is one of the most common and debilitating mood disorders in the world. It often goes hand in hand with anxiety and other psychiatric or mood disorders, and tends to breed a whole constellation of other problems aside, such as substance abuse. According to the World Health Organization, approximately 280 million people around the world suffer with depression. And of course, kind of goes without saying that depression typically precedes suicide, and WHO estimates about 70,000 deaths annually from suicide. I believe it's the second leading cause of death amongst teens and folks in their early 20s, which is really sad because it's very preventable with the correct treatment. And then, as I mentioned, depression is often comorbid with a wide range of other problems such as alcohol abuse, and that is its own can of worms. And also why I wanted to present on this topic is that if you Google search like what causes depression, there's a variety of sites that are sort of mainstream. I won't mention names, but sort of mainstream sites that offer health information, and they seem to more or less parrot the same information, more or less. You know, they're not all identical, but I think there's a lot of other contributing factors that are often left out. And I think this can be problematic because it can lead to a bias in identifying causes, and if you miss the cause of the disorder, then you by default may end up treating the wrong thing or not treating what is relevant. And so some of the commonly listed causes of depression, if you do your own search for this, is they will list things which are valid causes for sure. I'm not disputing that, but it's like they'll list trauma, adverse life events, a sense of loss, biological, biochemical abnormalities, history of substance abuse, medication side effects, traumatic brain injury, so on. And I guess I'm going to get into some other things that I think are contributory, at least from my review of the literature, my own personal clinical experience, for what that's worth, and just my general study and curiosity about all things health and wellness. So another thing is that I think it's a limitation of just being human that we don't know what we don't know. And that is kind of a phenomena of what I guess could be described as the very siloed health system as it currently stands. Like if you go to school to be an MD, you get training that is specific to that. And if you're a psychiatrist, you may view mental illness through the lens of biochemical abnormalities that you try to tweak or manipulate with very targeted pharmaceutical approaches. And if you're a psychologist, you may look at things more behaviorally. If you're a naturopath, your view may be different again. So, it's kind of like if you're trained to use a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I'm not generalizing that to, of course, all health practitioners, but there's a preponderance towards having that biased view if you're trained in a certain way. And if you go to like a nutritionist, for example, and say, like, I'm feeling down, the type of questions they will ask to elicit information from you will also be directed by their bias, probably. Because that's what they're trained to ask. And that's their way of understanding, that's their worldview of like how health and dysfunction arises. So there's articles on this, my number 2 on the slide. This may lead to confirmation or availability bias. that number 2 is just for reference that I have at the end of these slides. Articles that discuss this tendency of practitioners to default to a particular way of thinking and perhaps exclude other types of differential diagnoses, which are, differential diagnosis is an essential part of any sort of healthcare approach, but it's a Jekyll and Hyde phenomena because you cannot spend indefinite periods of time combing through potential differential diagnoses. Everything's time constraints, and you don't want to just assume a myriad of targets. You just want to try to get as close as you can. So it's always difficult. I'm not trying to oversimplify this. So you want to kind of hypothesize about what your best guess is based on your experience, what the research says, what you observe in the client, their report, and you don't want to delay treatment, right? Because delay can lead to other problems. So yeah, that said, I'm going to just kind of start discussing a few of the things that I feel like are often left out of the mainstream coverage of what can contribute to depression. And hypothyroidism is one. This is in no particular order. I'm just threw these things all together. They're somewhat grouped, but there's no sort of hierarchy of targets here. But the hypothyroidism is estimated to affect up to about 12% of the US population. I'm not sure what it is worldwide. It's more prevalent in females, which seems to parallel also the rates of depression and anxiety are typically higher in females than in males. And hypothyroidism symptoms mimic depression, such as lower mood, brain fog, loss of energy. This is something that can result from deficiencies, dietary deficiencies such as iodine, selenium, iron, and vitamin A. It can be a result of very low carbohydrate diets. It can result from toxin exposures and or smoking, and can result from excess goitrogens in the diet. So just to kind of cover those very briefly for the sake of brevity, because this video has a lot of different points to cover. If you look at iodine, for example, that's most predominantly found in seafood, but if you're not eating a lot of seafood, and then also the soil content of iodine, which would be reflected, I guess, in the nutrient composition of food grown in that soil, can vary astronomically from one region to the next. So that's a definite consideration. And probably a consideration if you are averse to eating any kind of seafood or seaweed. So again, like these are things that you'd be probably working with a nutritionist on. I'm not saying that you just arbitrarily start supplementing. It's not even my role to say that because I'm a psychologist, but I'm just saying things that you could be aware of, and when these are these stark and quite overtly apparent potential deficiencies, like that's something you could possibly explore with a nutritionist or your doctor, just to make sure, of course, that there aren't like nutrient and drug interactions, which are fairly rare, but they do happen. Vitamin A is a not so uncommon deficiency because true vitamin A in its biologically active form is only found in animal foods such as egg yolks and liver. And I know a lot of people are well aware that vitamin A is found in plant foods, but it's the beta-carotene or carotenoid version of vitamin A. And this has to be converted into the biologically active form such as is found in animal foods. So if you're a vegetarian, there's potentially a little bit more risk, and I think part of that is limited by epigenetic factors, like some people are not very efficient converters of carotenoids to vitamin A. So again, like also if you run a plant-based diet, the iron in plant foods is different than the iron in animal foods. If you're a female, that may affect you differently. So just some things to be aware of that can contribute to low thyroid function. Also, because the primary stimulator of insulin is carbohydrate in the diet, and insulin is involved in the production of thyroid hormone. If you were on a very low carbohydrate diet, I think that can contribute to low thyroid function. I know protein affects insulin too. Fat, not quite so much, but just that can contribute. And I think carbohydrates are involved in the the production of thyroid hormone itself, or oxidizing iodine to iodide, if I remember correctly. But essentially what it's saying is that if your insulin levels are too low and your carbohydrate intake is too low, that could contribute to this low thyroid function, or not enough iodide in the body. And then again, just toxin exposures, which actually can affect many bodily systems. And goitrogens, I think, are fairly rare occurrences. Like, they're not super widespread, but there are documented cases of this occurring where people develop goiter. You can Google that if you like. Of course, it's very physically obvious when someone has it. In terms of like the food intake that would prompt goiter to develop, I'm not sure. I know millet is very high. It's very actively goitrogenic. Certain foods, I misspelled kale on my slide, and I'm like tripping out on that I did that. But what I was going to say about kale is, like, I don't think kale would necessarily be a goitrogenic food if you were just eating kale, but I know like some people that are maybe more health food enthusiasts in the vegan and vegetarian department may be juicing a lot of it. And if you're juicing a lot, it's like you're consuming a concentration of kale, or what's in the kale, that is probably higher than if you were eating the whole food itself. So just a consideration for how these things can have that effect. So yeah, hypothyroidism, that's one to watch for. Another fairly common one is vitamin D deficiency. There's a really strong correlation with depression, but that doesn't, of course, equal causation. So we don't know if it necessarily prompts that, but sometimes where there's smoke, there's fire, right? Vitamin D deficiency seems to be more marked at higher and lower latitudes, which makes sense, right? Because the sun's rays are weaker, higher up and lower down. But it also occurs in equatorial zones. When I was still in grad school, one of the supervisors I was training under here in Hawaii would frequently do vitamin D testing on her patients. And even here in Hawaii, with a lot of sunshine, she found like the majority of her patients were deficient in vitamin D. And that kind of makes sense, given that we've been taught to, put on a lot of sunblock, which severely constrains the production of vitamin D from sunlight. And otherwise people may be just indoors a lot, or they may be wearing clothes outdoors, but one way or another, sunlight is one of the best sources of vitamin D, and you can certainly block that with an effective sunblock. There's a correlation too between incidence of schizophrenia at higher latitudes, but then there are many other things that are contributory with schizophrenia, so that will be a different discussion for a different day. In terms of foods, vitamin D is not widely available in food unless it's fortified with vitamin D. But like the best natural source that I know of is cod liver oil, and I'm not sure how many of you all are taking cod liver oil, but yeah, that's the best food source that I know of. And eggs from chickens raised on pasture rather than corn-fed apparently have a decent amount of vitamin D in it. So some fatty fish has some vitamin D. So vitamin D is important because it has critical interactive roles with vitamin A, with calcium, magnesium, and zinc, some other nutrients as well. Those nutrients also have roles in the body that link back to mood. Vitamin D regulates hundreds of genes. It's a very important player in immune function. Vitamin D deficiency is estimated to be really high, like somewhere around 70 or 80% of the population. And I think that may be one of the spokes in the wheel in terms of like why COVID outcomes have been so bad in the US. This also may be a contributing factor, is that obesity tends to exacerbate the deficiency because vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, and apparently if you're overweight, it tends to accumulate in adipose tissue, and it is not readily available for its use if it was circulating in the bloodstream, fulfilling its sort of physiological roles. So that's by no means a criticism of being overweight, at least not a moral one, or an attack on character. It's just physiologically that's what can happen. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the interactions with other nutrients as I go along, but this is a big one, and this seems to be fairly widespread, and there's fairly ample evidence to support this idea. I think there are, as always, in anything science, there's always conflicting information on certain topics, and the use of supplements seems like a thorny issue. I think part of that, when I talk about the next slide on magnesium deficiency, will explain some of that. So yeah, let me just explain magnesium. So magnesium, I guess you could say, is like, you can and you can't say this. I feel conflicted saying it, but it's like arguably the most important nutrient in the body. And I say that because the energy currency of the body, adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, only exists in the body bound to a magnesium ion. So if you don't have ATP, or if you don't have magnesium, you cannot have ATP. And if you have no energy, well, technically you're dead, I guess. But all the reactions that occur in the body, these biochemical processes, of which there are many trillions per day, are energy dependent. And we go through ATP. I forget, that's a long time since I read this little tidbit of knowledge, but it's like many thousands or millions of molecules of ATP per second all through the body. It's just an ongoing process. Interesting side note about the importance of ATP is that the way cyanide, which is obviously a lethal toxin, the way that kills people, and it kills them within, I think, like 5 or 10 seconds, is because it basically arrests the process of producing energy in the mitochondrial respiratory chain. It locks it up, and ATP cannot be generated, and just within a few seconds, not having that ATP readily available, it leads to death. So I think the use of energy in the body is actually kind of underestimated in that sense. And then magnesium deficiency is also estimated to be quite widespread in the US, basically because magnesium is most abundant in whole grains and nuts and seeds. And if you're eating a processed food diet, of course, it's mostly refined grains, and I think white flour has like virtually no magnesium in it. And if you're not eating nuts and seeds, you're not getting much. And then also certain vegetables have a decent amount of magnesium too. So it's kind of hit or miss. It really depends on quality of somebody's diet. So nonetheless, why magnesium is important with reference to the last slide is that when you take vitamin D in through the diet, it goes through a range of steps until it's metabolized to its final biologically active form, which I think is 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D. But that final conversion step is dependent on a magnesium dependent enzyme. So if you don't have magnesium, you can have these precursors to vitamin D circulating around in your body, and it may even look like you have normal vitamin D levels, but you're not actually generating the final active component of vitamin D, and that is a problem. And there was one study I looked at that the vitamin D deficiency was corrected by magnesium supplementation without adding vitamin D to the diet. So what they were showing is that somebody looked like they were vitamin D deficient, but they were actually magnesium deficient, and once the magnesium was there, they were able to correct that imbalance. So magnesium, that's one example of why it's important. It also interacts with a range of other nutrients. It plays a key role in DNA synthesis, transcription, protein synthesis, vitamin D metabolism, as I mentioned, and then regulating NMDA receptors on neurons. So NMDA receptors are N-methyl deaspartate receptors that are I should have refreshed my memory on this one because I'm just going off old memory, but it's basically like they're dual-gated ligand channels, which means that typically when something binds to a receptor, it opens up a channel in the membrane of the cell, and it allows for a change. Maybe like sodium will come rushing into the cell and chloride will go rushing out, and that causes the neuron to fire. So that's the case with many receptors, but some receptors are, I guess you could say, they're almost like a door that requires 2 keys to unlock, whereas most doors would be just 1 key, and I mean 2 different keys. And so with the NMDA receptor, I believe it's governed or blocked or locked, in a sense you could say, by magnesium and glycine. And so if you don't have enough magnesium around, then that can precipitate altered firing of the NMDA receptor, and that seems to correlate with anxiety. So magnesium is kind of well established as having this sort of calming effect in the brain, and that because it seems to inhibit neuronal firing or excessive neuronal firing. So, and then just also as an interesting point too, the human brain is about 3% of our body weight, yet consumes upwards of 20% of our energy needs. So it's very metabolically active. And also if you look at fMRI scans of the brain in somebody that's, I could say like neurotypical or without a mood disorder, and you compare it with somebody that's depressed, it looks very different. It looks like the brain is like hypometabolic or very low metabolic activity. It's almost like the brain is off, I guess you could say, but it's not energized. And I guess you could say that can be cause and effect reversed, in the sense that maybe it's that way because the person is depressed and feeling low and so on, or maybe you could say that because the brain is inactive and there's no energy in the brain is not animated and feeling alive. So theoretically possible that a low energy state in the brain contributes to depression. So that would be, I guess, more like a metabolic explanation of depression. And then another one is low fiber diet. So there's some data to support this. There's also some data to support the idea that soluble fiber is more beneficial than insoluble fiber. So soluble fiber is mostly found in vegetables and fruits, whereas insoluble fiber is more typically found in grains. This effect seems to be mediated by the way the gut microbiome responds to the fiber, because fiber is food for them. So there's not a wealth of data on that, but there's some, and it's difficult to extract the meaningful data from there because, of course, you're not just eating the fiber, you're eating the whole food. If you're eating an apple, there's a lot of other things in apples, quercetin and so on, like these other nutrients that may support better mood. So either way, it still boils down to like a whole foods diet and the role that these certain foods play in the way they interact with the gut microbiome. And of course, there's a lot of information on that, which I've got a separate slide on that one. So also, I guess you could say that if you're eating fiber naturally, like not as a supplement, like psyllium husk or something, I guess it's kind of natural, but just from food itself, those types of diets tend to have more of an anti-inflammatory effect on the body anyway. So they also seem to support the reduction of gut permeability. I would also say as a caveat that some people seem to thrive on zero fiber diets, like the carnivore diet. Not something I've tried personally, but I've seen anecdotally that some people seem to do very well on that. So maybe it's somewhat individual too. But the gut microbiome is an interesting one, and it's colloquially referred to as the second brain or the enteric nervous system due to the large population of neurons and glial cells in the gut. So the gut is a major source of neurotransmitters such as serotonin and GABA. It also produces short-chain fatty acids and peptides such as brain-derived neurotrophic factor that seem to be implicated in synaptogenesis and differentiation of neurons and growth of nerve factors in the brain. When I say the gut is a major source, what I mean is the microbes in the gut, the specific population of gut bacteria. And the communication from the gut to the brain is via the vagus nerve, or the wandering nerve that connects most of the visceral organs and the heart to the brain. And that's a two-way street with communication from the organs to the brain and from the brain back to the organs. Most of that information actually seems to flow up towards the brain, so it's kind of like an input channel. And this is a really fascinating and emerging interesting area of study, because a lot of the animal studies are where they've done things like fecal transplants, like transplanting the bacteria from one mouse to another mouse, also simultaneously seems to transfer the behavior. So if it's a mouse that's anxious and it's the fecal transplant or gut bacteria transplant to a mouse that has normative behavior, the recipient will start to exhibit anxious behaviors, and vice versa. And the same goes for adiposity, like the tendency to gain weight. So they're very. This could be. I mean, there are books on this, so it's a huge subject, and I don't want to go too far into it. But essentially, there's really clear evidence that the specific types of gut microbiota that we carry play a significant role in our mood. And in these animal studies, what's also interesting is if you cut the vagus nerve of vagotomy, these behavioral changes in transplanting one type of bacteria from one mouse to another, or changing the diet in a specific animal, all of these changes are eliminated when the vagus nerve is cut. So it's really kind of clearly indicating that whatever changes are happening in the gut are mediated by that connection from the vagus nerve to the brain. And when you sever that connection, those changes are severed as well. So that's a very specific line of communication and very interesting. Not fully elucidated at this point, not fully understood, but definitely considering the effect that food and nutrients have on the gut and the role the gut plays in health, it's understandable why this could be dubbed the second brain. So something to pay attention to. I could go further into it and say that the immune system is mostly concentrated around the gut. So if the gut is porous or leaky, which is a phenomenon, of course, known as leaky gut, then the first, I guess, line of defense is the immune system that sits on the opposite side of the gut. And if the immune system is triggered, then that can induce like a release of a range of inflammatory chemicals, cytokines, interleukins, and so on. And we know that leaky gut exists because if you look in blood samples of people that are affected by this, you may find compounds such as lipopolysaccharides or propionic acid, which are things that may be found in the gut but don't belong in the bloodstream. And they're highly inflammatory or highly pro-inflammatory. And the blood-brain barrier, which is another barrier that's similar to the gut barrier that is meant to protect the brain from toxins in the blood, is similar to the gut barrier. And if the gut lining is compromised through stress, through toxins, through excess sugar in the diet, and so on, things that irritate the gut and damage it. For some people it's gluten or something in the wheat. Maybe it's not the gluten, maybe it's something else. But if that is compromised, then it's possible that the blood-brain barrier is subsequently compromised, and if inflammation crosses into the brain, which we know happens, then you have activation of the brain's own immune system, which is primarily glial cells, and then they in turn release their own pro-inflammatory mediators, and then that inflammation in the brain seems to correlate strongly with various mood disorders, with autism, for example. So there's a lot of connection between the gut and the brain, and unfortunately it's something that's not, I think, widely discussed, or at least it wasn't in my school. I'm not sure it is very much in medical school either, but it's an emerging area of science, so something to watch and keep an eye on. And I think it matters in the context of the fact that, you know, there's a lot of processed food in the environment these days, and if you look at traditional hunter-gatherer diets, these were diets that, of course, there was no processed food, there was pretty much no sugar, and there was a very, very high fiber content. I think, if I remember right, something like an estimated 50 grams or more a day of fiber, whereas I think the average in the standard American diet is, or what the USDA recommend is, I think, less than 20 grams, but quite different. So a lot of the different things that affect gut health, but their gut health can certainly affect mental health. Okay, so leading on from that, another one that is actually pretty strong evidence for this one, excess sugar consumption. The average American now consumes about 150 pounds of sugar a year, In traditional hunter-gatherer societies, it was probably a tenth of that. Much lower. Then there was an article in the Depression and Anxiety Journal which found an almost perfect correlation between sugar consumption and depression in 6 countries that they studied. Now, of course, I know correlation does not equal causation. It's an association, but I would say it's very rare to get a correlation as high as that. I believe it was 0.94, which one is a perfect correlation. So it's really, really strong. And it does make a lot of sense. There's a lot of evidence that supports that idea because sugar seems to feed inflammation. It feeds pathogenic gut bacteria. It feeds yeast, and overproduction of yeast in the gut is associated with other health problems, such as the propionic acid that I mentioned. Elevated levels of yeast can produce their own acetaldehyde, which is kind of like an alcohol metabolite, and there's even well, I'm not sure how rare it is. Maybe it's not that rare, but it's there's a condition called auto-brewery syndrome, where you're literally brewing alcohol in your gut because you have so much yeast. And I know of at least one documented case of somebody that I believe had a DUI, and they weren't drinking. That was just their blood levels of alcohol were high. That was the yeast in their gut, yeast overgrowth, and the sugar's feeding that. So yeah, sugar is problematic. It also, again, this is another big subject, but it increases oxidative damage and stress. So the more refined carbohydrates in the diet there are, the more it seems to tax the mitochondria and tends to induce oxidative or free radical damage in the mitochondria of the cell. So it can damage the mitochondria themselves, or it can damage the cell. That's a pretty vast topic, and I need to refresh myself on it before I talk in any depth about it. And of course, excess sugar consumption is also pretty clearly linked to becoming overweight. So something for maybe another discussion, but just to be aware of how much more sugar is consumed by most people in modern society, and a lot of times it's hidden where you are not even aware. It's not always explicitly sugary foods. It can be something like condiments, right? That can be loaded with sugar, or salad dressing, or something like that. Okay, so what's next? This is another one that is pretty strong evidence for this one, and this one is way above my pay grade. It's a very complicated topic, but I think it can be simplified to fit within a heuristic model, such that if you look at it just broadly speaking in a way that's maybe commonsensical, you can approach it from that vantage point. So, but just as a brief overview, in hunter-gatherer populations, the intake of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids was estimated to be somewhere between 5:1 and 1:1. And in the standard American diet, it's likely closer to 15:1 to 20:1. So very much higher. That seems largely attributable to the large increase in vegetable oil consumption. So when I say vegetable oils, I'm talking about things like safflower and corn oil and soy that are not typically oil foods. Like if you don't really think of like a soybean as like an olive, right? Which olive and coconut, for example, which we know naturally, like you just squeeze the stuff and the oil comes out. They have to go through extensive processing. The refineries that make these products look more like oil factories, like for refining petroleum, than they do for something that makes food. And these vegetable oils have a much higher ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, if they have omega-3 at all. And then on top of that, if you look at animal products, or like what cows and chickens are fed, a lot of that is these days is grain, whereas historically and naturally it would be grass, or chickens would just kind of roam around the yard and eating bugs and so on. So indirectly, animal foods are more loaded up if they're from commercial feedlot operations with these omega-6 fatty acids. And the findings on the benefits of omega-3 are mixed. I'm sure everyone's heard about, like, oh, fish oil is good for your heart and for preventing cardiovascular disease and so on. There's a lot of mixed reviews about their benefit for mental health. It kind of cuts both ways. Like, there's a lot to support the idea that it's beneficial, omega-3s do seem to have this sort of anti-inflammatory effect, and they appear to potentiate the effectiveness of drugs like SSRIs. So I think the reason that may be is that omega-3 fatty acids are essential for cell membrane fluidity and the overall shape and structure of a cell membrane. And as I've talked about in some of my other videos, the way the cell membrane is constructed with these lipid rafts and these various lipids, there's a lot of different lipids or fats that constitute a cell membrane. Cholesterol is one of the main ones, and then there are omega-3s, there's different phospholipids. But you have to bear in mind that receptors are embedded in the cell membrane, many thousands in a single cell. Those receptors are the ones that interact with the extracellular space. Those are the things that serotonin and glutamate and GABA and other neurotransmitters and peptides and so on, that they bind to the receptor. That's how they activate or exert their effect on a cell. And if the cell is misshapen because it's made up of the wrong composition of lipids, then that by nature can affect the way the receptors read their environment. And this plausibly is why omega-3 supplementation, if you're in a diet, if you have a diet that's typically been deficient in omega-3s, by enhancing the way the cell is made up, the receptors are better able to read their environment and then more effectively able to bind with the serotonin that is being augmented by the SSRI drug. So there's pretty clear evidence for that. And then omega-6s are, I don't want to paint them all as bad. They're not bad. They serve very crucial functions in the body. But they are more typically associated with inflammatory processes because they are metabolized into such things as prostaglandins, such as COX-1 and COX-2, that's cyclooxygenase, and leukotriene. So COX-1 and COX-2, for example, play a role in mediating acute and chronic inflammation. And if you look at a drug like ibuprofen, these non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, they inhibit COX activity. And by inhibiting COX activity, then you suppress inflammation. And I think I even remember a study somewhere that was saying that these drugs have some beneficial effect on conditions like Alzheimer's. I'm not sure how marked that benefit was. I just remember that there was a benefit, and that makes sense because Alzheimer's has inflammation as one of its sort of traits or fingerprints, I guess you could say, that one of the smoking guns with Alzheimer's. Unfortunately, these drugs are also very hard on the stomach, and they are associated with stomach bleeding and not great for your health. I think maybe the leading cause of ER admissions in the US is actually related to the use of these non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, because they're over the counter and then people mix alcohol with them, or they have them on an empty stomach or whatever they do, and damages the gut, and they end up with a bleeding stomach. It's not great. Whereas something like turmeric, just incidentally speaking, turmeric actually acts on COX-1 and or COX-2, and it has this sort of drug-like effect, but it's much milder, so it's able to inhibit inflammation without all these damaging side effects. So, yeah, just quickly, why is the ratio so out of whack in the standard American diet? I kind of alluded to that. It's mostly the vegetable oils and that the food that is fed to animals, and then people in turn eat the steak or the chicken or the eggs. And these animals have a ratio that is very different than animals raised on grass, for example. And so that's one of the things that's biasing omega-6 consumption towards such high levels. And omega-3s are most abundant in these pasture-raised animal products and seafood, like fatty fish such as salmon, and cod liver oil, and so on. But this is another kind of confounding variable, is the role of oxidized oils, which again is a vast topic, and I can't go into it much now, but just to touch on it quickly, that these are polyunsaturated fatty acids, long-chain fatty acids, which have these double carbon bonds, are quite vulnerable and susceptible to inflammation processes or oxidative stress, which breaks the bonds, and then you have these deformed, misshapen fatty acids that are no longer in their natural state. And then they tend to propagate this free radical or oxidative damage cascade. In other words, one damaged molecule will damage another molecule in trying to stabilize itself. And that becomes the sort of domino reaction, and it propagates and it can damage the cell membrane and have all these other deleterious effects. And there's some concern that some of these fish oils on the market, because they go through such extensive processing to make them like odorless and tasteless and so on, they're damaged in the process. They may be damaged to exposure to light or heat. So that's another topic in and of itself. Maybe I can discuss that elsewhere, but it's a consideration for fish oil supplementation versus, for example, eating wild-caught Alaskan salmon, deep cold water fish, and eating it in this whole food matrix, which may present a very different effect as long as it's not like overcooked and it's fresh and so on. Okay, I'm gonna leave off on that one because that rabbit hole goes deep. So the endocannabinoid system is also a possible contributor to depression, and not something that I see talked about very often, even though things like CBD oil are becoming more popular. Not something that I have personal experience with, because I think I have this understanding about the endogenous endocannabinoids. And this is the thing, is that our bodies make our own. And most people associate cannabinoids with marijuana. And it fills a vital role as a neurotransmitter in the brain. And some of the roles it fills are regulating mood, appetite, stress and cortisol response, memory, and pain perception. And endocannabinoids also have this sort of symbiotic relationship with dopamine, so they help enhance the effect of dopamine in the brain. So what happens with these endogenous cannabinoids is that they are synthesized from arachidonic acid, which is one of the omega-6 fatty acids that I was just talking about on the last slide. Another example of like that omega-6s are not necessarily bad, they just have various functions, and it's helpful when they're in the correct ratios. And so when calcium enters the cell, this is one of the events that triggers the production of, or activation of, enzymes that catalyze production of these endocannabinoids in the brain. Now, that opens up a whole nother can of worms, because a lot of people have low blood levels of calcium. Well, when I say a lot of people, there's not real, I couldn't find a lot of good data on that, but interestingly, in the article on my website, I list the article, there's some evidence emerging that people that are having very poor outcomes from COVID or are dying from COVID have hypocalcemia. And I don't know if it's clear that it's the hypocalcemia, the low calcium, that is precipitating the poor COVID outcome, or it could be the fact that if you're low in calcium, it may be because you're low in vitamin D. And of course, we know what a critical role that plays in the immune system. So what I'm getting at with the calcium then is, if your calcium levels are low, and that is one of the triggers for the production of the endocannabinoids, then maybe you're not making enough. And then that might account for why some people seem to benefit from marijuana use. It's not so much the psychoactive part of the THC, but it's the CBD that their bodies are not making enough of. So if you have the correct foods in the diet, which, to be fair, what I'm thinking of is things like liver and egg yolks, because that has a lot of arachidonic acid in it, but then it's also complemented with things like a good quality cod liver oil and pastured meats and so on. You're getting that balance of omega-6 and 3, and these other things like calcium and vitamin D and magnesium that has a sort of symbiotic relationship with calcium. All these things are able to regulate each other, and that makes a lot of sense. So just wanted to point that out very quickly. That's another system in the brain that is seldom referenced in the causes of depression. And then something not related to nutrition, this one that I've dubbed, what am I doing here? So what does that mean? What am I doing here? Good question. What I mean by that is having this sort of sense of purpose in life. And this is a really strong antidepressant, and I would recommend a really good book if It's relatively short. Like, it's the kind of book you could probably read in a day. Viktor Frankl's book Man's Search for Meaning, and Viktor Frankl, for those who don't know, was a survivor of the concentration camp in Auschwitz, Germany, in World War II. Lost his wife and numerous family members. I think he was in the concentration camp for about 3 or 4 years and endured incredible hardship there, and witnessed many, many thousands of people die. And the only thing that kind of kept him going was that he felt he had this purpose in life, which was because he was a doctor, he was a psychiatrist, I believe, and wanted to share he was working on a book, and he knew that was the one thing that the Nazis could not take from him, was his will to fulfill this purpose in life. And he described various instances of people that were kind of hanging on to hope by a thread under this incredible hardship and starvation and cold and torture and all these different things they went through. And he would notice that if somebody kind of lost the will to live, they would always die within about 2 or 3 days. And he would say that seemed to spike around Christmas and New Year's, seemingly because people hoped that the war would be over by that time. It was an arbitrary sort of hope that, well, by Christmas I'll be home with my family, or by New Year's I'll be home, and then that day would come and pass, and the war was still ongoing. They were not liberated, and then they thought, well, oh my God, I can't endure another year of being here, and they would give up, and within 2 or 3 days they would pass away. And he surmised that the thing that kept him going was this determination that he was going to fulfill his life's purpose and finish his book, and no one could stop him, unless he was killed, of course, but he wasn't. He survived. And then Frankl also made this really interesting quote, which was saying that happiness cannot be pursued, it must ensue, which I think is a really profound statement. We do have this idea that happiness needs to be pursued, but what he was talking about was more like finding your sense of purpose and passion in life, what you feel like you were born to do, that is uniquely you, and happiness will flow out of that activity. And a related topic, I think, maybe is that we have this sort of societal expectation of what we're supposed to do when we come into this world and what success means. And for a lot of people, that is academic success, or maybe success as an athlete and being famous and making a lot of money. And maybe for a lot of people, that is an apt path to pursue, but I'm not sure it's the path for everybody. And this is where it can be hard. Like, a lot of parents may be wanting the best for their kids, and they want them to achieve well at school. There can be a lot of pressure, and sometimes there isn't a lot of pressure on finding out what the child is like really meant to do. What are they born? Where do their talents really lie? What if they don't succeed, in the academic world or the business world? Like, are there other talents that they can draw on that are equally special and meaningful, or maybe even more special and meaningful? And then recognizing the virtue in those talents and pursuing those goals and capitalizing on their gifts. And I think that Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences is worth considering there. So, I don't even know if I can remember all of Gardner's 7 intelligences, but they're basically the kinesthetic and I think visuospatial, the ability to introspect, sort of social intelligence, emotional intelligence. So what Gardner was basically saying is that intelligence is not only what is measured on an IQ test, it's also people's ability to be creative and to be artistic, to write poetry, to create and compose music, and so on. So just throwing that out there as consideration if you feel like you're in a rut pursuing society's expectations of what success is, and maybe you have a different value around that. I'm certainly not anti-education, of course, because I went to like the highest levels of education myself. And I love science, but I think science is a two-edged sword because it has enhanced and improved lives in so many ways, and it's also had some deleterious effects on our planet, right? The planet is in some ways being destroyed, and computers, for all the wonders of technology, also create a lot of problems for people. Social media is another two-edged sword, right? So all these things, like science is obviously good and bad, depending on how you use it. But not being scientific is also definitely a talent worth exploring, right? And it's also just to point out like how you look at the type of work that you do. So there's another book that I like by Martin Seligman, who's kind of the pioneer behind positive psychology, and his book is Authentic Happiness, if you want to get it. And he discusses how, like, if somebody's a garbage collector, for example, some people might frown on that and think, well, that's a pretty low job on the social hierarchy. But if you think what the world would be like if there was no trash collection, like, it would be unlivable. It would be so unsanitary. Trash would be piled up everywhere. There'd be rats running around all over the place, and cockroaches, and it would stink and look terrible, and so on. So if you look at that kind of job as something that makes the world a livable and a beautiful place, suddenly it takes on a whole new meaning. And maybe for somebody in that job, it might think that they're in a low kind of job. Like, I mean, I'm certainly not marginalizing that role. I'm just saying if somebody perceived their job as not being meaningful, changing the way you look at it can alter that perspective a lot and make it seem like something that you are actually contributing a lot to society. So yeah, just in a summary, like finding that sense of purpose in life can make a very big difference to your sort of mood and well-being. And then a quick touch on mindlessness, which I say this in the context of maybe mindfulness's opposite. Mindfulness is one of those things that has many definitions that fit within the frame of meditation. It can also just mean staying present. For example, like watching a sunset and appreciating its beauty, and not watching the sunset and thinking about the bills you have to pay and the problems with your neighbor and your car broke down and all the things that might go wrong with the world tomorrow, right? It's just learning to put those thoughts on hold and be in the moment and just appreciate and be immersed in your five senses. And I think it's very hard when you're anxious and depressed to snap out of that. But being mindful is one of the strategies you can use to mitigate those relentless anxious thoughts. And it can allow you to build the ability to tolerate emotions. So I think that unpleasant emotions are a natural part of life, and there's not much that we can do to entirely avoid them. But it's not often that it's difficult emotions that get people into trouble. It's the way they react to them. So for example, if someone cannot tolerate that emotion and they feel like, okay, I need a bottle of vodka right now, that's usually where the problems begin. So if you can learn emotional tolerance, you can typically get through that and recognize that that uncomfortable emotion will pass. And it will pass much faster than if you act on it in a maladaptive way, such as getting drunk. And then just being mindful can also help slow down racing and anxious thoughts and facilitate better communication through better listening as well. And then another one is relationships. This is one that there's very strong evidence for in terms of ameliorating symptoms of depression. It's one of the strongest predictors of lifelong happiness. I would say that the high prevalence of divorce and domestic abuse and violence and harsh treatment of children probably attests to how much people struggle to form and maintain good relationships. Relationships should be built on trust, empathy, compassion, and validation. So it means a lot of understanding, developing understanding, being curious about the other person's experiences rather than rushing to project your thoughts onto somebody else. Very active listening. Communicating that the emotional experience of the other person makes sense rather than saying that there's no reason for them to feel that way. If somebody feels a certain way, it's because they feel that way. We don't know what that person feels like exactly, right? That's their experience of it. So we can only try to empathize with it, but we certainly shouldn't dismiss it. It doesn't mean that the circumstances around the person feeling that way are necessarily accurate, and that's something to maybe problem solve, but I think the lack of validation in relationships is one of the main things that tends to fracture them. If you can learn to make this process about understanding and meeting the other person's needs, that can go a long way to build relationships, as contrasted with obsessing about getting your needs met all the time. Of course, I'm not saying your needs shouldn't be met, but if you focus on the other person's needs, I think it's more likely that the person will reciprocate and meet your needs too. And then just as I mentioned, active listening. I think this is important because in a lot of conflict in relationships, people will be formulating their response before the other person has finished talking, which indicates that you're not really listening. And probably if you're not really listening, you're not fully understanding what the person is saying and why. And so just trying to really understand other people can go such a long way to mitigating the fallout of conflict in relationships. And I would just add there that I think relationships this is not only for intimate relationships and husband and wife and so on, but also with parents to children. Unless there's an emergency or you're trying to yank the kid out of the way of a moving car, I don't really think that yelling is necessary, because it just, well, I don't know if I've met a person that actually said they enjoyed being yelled at. And all yelling does really typically is that it provokes and pushes somebody into fight or flight emotional status, where they'll either become defensive or they'll shut down, or they may retaliate and become aggressive. It doesn't necessarily help to yell to get your point across. And I think civil discourse and diplomatic communication can go a lot further. And then the last one that I wanted to mention, for some reason, generational trauma is very seldom. In fact, I couldn't even find a single site that I saw that actually mentioned this. And generational trauma is something that can result from prolonged stress at various levels. So it can happen within a family system, but maybe more typically wars such as World War I, World War II, issues like genocide, slavery, displacement of people from their lands and culture. Unfortunately, the world's seen a lot of that. You know, the Aborigines in Australia, the Native Americans in North America, Hawaiians from Hawaii, various tribes around the world. Like, this has just been going on for millennia, right? And it has these long-term reverberations because it's highly traumatic for the people that survive and lose land, culture, family members, maybe are drawn into slavery. Highly stressful. And then those, from what we know about epigenetics now, is that those precipitate genetic changes in the offspring or the children, so that they are born naturally wired for stress. So they're like born hyper vigilant. They're born kind of with these sort of almost like, I wouldn't say full-blown PTSD symptoms, but maybe more colicky babies and babies that are just more reactive to stress. And then on top of that, the parents or the caregivers are carrying their own trauma, and that may make them more cranky, less patient, less nurturing. They're distracted. They're not able to be fully present with their children and fully engage in sharing love and nurturing and emotional closeness, because they're constantly distracted by their own trauma. It's very hard to just turn that stuff off when it's so wired into your nervous system and you've been through something incredibly traumatic. And then that in turn influences the way their children are raised and the way the children see the world as a place that's not necessarily safe. It's kind of dangerous. They don't know that sort of sense of attachment security. And then the can gets kicked down the road. It gets passed along from generation to generation. And I think this might be an example of like why some of us struggle to wrap our head around these incidents of what is termed police brutality with cops and like African American males. And I think I try to see both sides of it, because I think on that topic, for example, I think I don't know what it's like to be a cop, but I imagine it's really hard because many police are painted as the bad guy and they walk around with a target on their back, and they never know if that day on the job is going to be their last day on the job. And I'm sure many of them, or most of them, sign up for this work to help society, and then they're painted as being bullies or being bad. So it's hard for them. And then on the other hand, if you understand the way African Americans and what they've gone through, why they would be suspicious of police activity, for example. So I just think when you look at it in the full context of the trauma that they've been through, it makes sense that they would be more hyper-vigilant or hyper-reactive to something like being pulled over on a traffic stop or something like that. Besides whatever amount of evidence supports, I don't even know the evidence around that necessarily matters. It definitely, to me, it matters in the context of what they as a people have been through, however. And that might explain more around why they feel distrustful of authority or police presence and so on. So yeah, that's about it. And I'm just going to wrap up with this final slide, which is like, what do you do with all of this? What do you do now? So this is obviously not a comprehensive review of what causes depression. It's only a brief summary of what I see is often being left out of the discussion. And it might be useful information if you or someone you know has been in treatment for depression for some time, like maybe 3 to 6 months, and the depression has not lifted. I do not present this as a way to, or like a map to self-medicate. I would say please discuss ideas herein with your healthcare professional. Please don't replace your treatment with these concepts. They are intended as adjunctive information only, so maybe something to discuss with your healthcare provider to get expert guidance on. I think it's possible that depression is any combination of all of the above, and it might be none of the above. It's really just to try to bring some awareness to other tools that you can use to enhance your well-being. So there are others that I didn't even mention, such as the natural antidepressant effects of exercise. That's a huge one in and of itself, and I think we all know that most of the Western civilization is increasingly sedentary and not getting as much exercise and time outdoors and time in nature and so on. And then I would just say too that humans and their situations are quite complex, and what works for you might not work for someone else, and vice versa. So please be aware of social comparison. That's a slippery slope, maybe an evil trap to fall into. Try to figure out what works for you. There's going to always be things that work for other people that do work for you, and other things that just don't. We're just biologically different, and looking at these things, for example, we can see there are many, many contributing factors to what can cause your moods to be low. So yeah, that is about it. I think I will probably expand on some of these topics in other videos because they merit their own attention. Just as a reminder, please don't take any of this as medical advice or advice to substitute for treatment you may be in. It's meant only as educational and informational, and these are mostly my own opinions that I've gleaned from. I try to pull from the evidence base. I'm not making these things up. I have a couple references here. There are more references in my article and my blog post on this topic. So you can certainly kind of use these as a springboard to find your own information. And if you have any questions or comments, maybe post those, and then I'll see if I can respond to those as well. So yeah, hope that you found something here useful, and I will see you again on the next episode. All right, aloha.